Spring of 1887 arrived in Montana Territory with deceptive gentleness, painting the foothills with wildflowers while winter's chill still lingered in the shadows. For Eleanor Mitchell, stepping off the Northern Pacific Railway onto the crude, wooden platform of Clearwater Station represented the end of a 1,000-mile journey and the beginning of an uncertain future. Clutching her single valise and the creased photograph of her intended husband, she scanned the waiting faces for the man who had promised her a new life through carefully penned letters. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But as minutes stretched into hours and the station emptied, the devastating truth became clear. She had been abandoned, in a strange town with nowhere to turn. What Eleanor couldn't know, as she fought back tears of humiliation, was that her true destiny waited just beyond the station, in the form of a tall, broad-shouldered rancher whose haunted eyes spoke volumes his throat could not. Mason Hayes hadn't uttered a word since returning from the horrors of war 3 years earlier, but something about the abandoned bride stirred an emotion he'd thought long dead. Without language to explain, he would need to find another way too. Show her that sometimes the deepest communications require no voice at all. The journey west had been interminable. For 6 days, Eleanor Mitchell had watched America transform outside her train window, the tidy farms of Pennsylvania giving way, to the vast grasslands of the Midwest, then the wild, jutting mountains of Montana Territory. Each mile had carried her further from everything familiar, propelled by equal measures of desperation and hope. The threadbare carpet bag resting on her lap contained all she had salvaged from her former life: 2 changes of clothes, a brush, with most of its bristles intact, her mother's tarnished silver locket, and a well-worn Bible that had belonged to her father. Hidden in its pages was her last $5, emergency money she prayed she wouldn't need. Eleanor smoothed the wrinkles from her best blue traveling dress for the dozenth time since dawn. The garment had seen better days, but she had spent the night carefully mending loose seams and sponging away travel dust. First impressions mattered, especially when meeting the man she had agreed to marry. "Clearwater Station, Clearwater!" the conductor called, moving through the passenger car. "End of the line for this route." Eleanor's stomach tightened. She retrieved the photograph from her pocket, a stern-faced man with a luxurious mustache and pomaded hair. Herbert Wallace, owner of the Wallace Mercantile, who had advertised for an educated woman of good character and modest expectations in a matrimonial newspaper. Their correspondence had been brief but promising. Herbert sought a wife to help manage his store and provide companionship in the growing frontier town. Eleanor, 24 and facing spinsterhood after her father's death, left her penniless, had few alternatives. Teaching positions were scarce, and living with her married cousin Martha had become untenable when Martha's husband made his intentions all too clear one evening while his wife visited her sister. The train lurched to a stop with a great hissing of steam. Eleanor gathered her belongings and made her way to the exit, where the conductor helped her descend to the platform. "Good luck to you, miss," he offered with a kindly nod, having learned her purpose during the long journey. "Thank you," Eleanor replied, summoning a smile that belied her nerves. Clearwater Station consisted of little more than a wooden platform, a small ticket office, and a covered waiting area. Beyond it, the town proper stretched along a wide dirt road, a collection of wooden buildings with false fronts announcing their importance. The Wallace Mercantile was visible from where she stood, its painted sign larger than those of neighboring establishments. Eleanor scanned the dozen or so people milling about the platform. Most appeared to be meeting family members or conducting business. No one approached her. No one resembled the photograph in her hand. "Excuse me," she asked a passing porter. "What time is it, please?" 2:15, ma'am, he replied before hurrying away with a trunk balanced on his shoulder. Herbert's last letter had been explicit. I shall meet you at the station upon the 2:15 arrival on April 18th. Look for a man in a brown suit with a red carnation. There were no brown suits on the platform. No red carnations. By 3 o'clock, Eleanor was one of only 3 people remaining at the station. By 4, she sat alone on a bench, her valise clutched in white-knuckled hands as she fought rising panic. The afternoon sun slanted lower, casting long shadows across the weathered boards beneath her feet. "Station's closing for the evening, miss," the station master finally announced, jangling his keys. "You waiting on someone?" "Yes," Eleanor managed, pride warring with practicality. "Mr. Herbert Wallace. He was to meet me on this train." The station master's expression shifted from impatience to something closer to pity. "Herbert Wallace?" He cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding. Mr. Wallace left town near 3 weeks ago, sold his store to the Peterson brothers, and headed to Seattle, from what I heard." The words struck Eleanor like physical blows. "That's impossible. I received a letter from him just 10 days ago, confirming our arrangement." "Can't speak to that, miss. Only know what I saw with my own eyes. There was an announcement in the Clearwater Register about the store changing hands." He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with her distress. "You got people in town? Someone expecting you?" "No," Eleanor whispered, her mind racing. "No one." The station master shifted his weight, keys jingling. "There's a boarding house down the street. Mrs. Byrne runs a respectable place. Maybe she has a room." "Thank you," Eleanor responded automatically, though panic was setting in. Her carefully planned future had evaporated in an instant, leaving her stranded in a town where she knew no one, with barely enough money for a few nights' lodging. The station master locked the ticket office and departed with an awkward tip of his hat, leaving Eleanor alone as the afternoon shadows lengthened. Resigned, she gathered her valise and stepped from the platform onto the main street, determined to find Mrs. Byrne's boarding house before darkness fell. She had taken no more than 20 paces when the sound of approaching horses made her turn. A wagon rolled toward the station, driven by a broad-shouldered man in a worn leather vest and faded work shirt. He pulled the horses to a stop a few feet from where she stood, studying her with an intensity that made her clutch her valise tighter. The man was somewhere in his 30s, with the weathered complexion of someone who spent his days outdoors. A beard shadowed his jaw, and beneath the brim of his hat, his eyes were a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin. A jagged scar ran from just below his right ear and disappeared beneath his collar. Eleanor took an instinctive step backward. She was alone, the station deserted, and while the man didn't appear threatening, frontier towns harbored all manner of characters. The stranger made no move to approach her. Instead, he reached into his pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, which he held out to her with a work-roughened hand. Hesitantly, Eleanor accepted it. The note, written in a neat feminine script, read, "This is Mason Hayes. He owns the Double H Ranch outside town. He can't speak, but he's offering you a ride to Mrs. Byrne's boarding house if you need one." Confused, Eleanor looked up. "How did you know I needed a place to stay?" Mason Hayes made a gesture toward the now locked station, then pointed to her. "Valise," his meaning clear. A woman alone at a closed train station obviously needed accommodation. Yes, I suppose it's rather obvious." Eleanor hesitated, weighing her options. Accepting a ride from a strange man went against everything she'd been taught about proper behavior, but darkness was approaching and she had no idea where to find the boarding house. Before she could decide, Mason withdrew another piece of paper from his pocket and scribbled something on it with a stubby pencil. He handed it to her. "Mrs. Byrne is my aunt. I deliver supplies to her weekly. She's expecting me today." The simple explanation eased some of Eleanor's trepidation. Riding with him would be improper under normal circumstances, but these were hardly normal circumstances. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. I would appreciate the ride. Mason nodded once, then gestured toward the wagon's bench seat, before walking around to stow her valise in the back. When he returned to help her up, Eleanor couldn't help noticing the gentle strength in his hands as he assisted her, or the fact that he kept a respectful distance once she was seated. As they headed down the main street, Eleanor found herself sneaking glances at her silent companion. Unlike Herbert's carefully posed photograph, Mason Hayes seemed entirely unaware of his appearance. His clothes were clean but well worn, his hands calloused from labor. The scar on his neck disappeared into his collar, and she wondered about its origin. The note had said he couldn't speak, and she found herself curious about whether this was related to his injury. "Have you lived in Clearwater long, Mr. Hayes?" she asked, partly from genuine curiosity and partly to break the uncomfortable silence. He held up 5 fingers. 5 years? He nodded. "And you ranch outside of town?" Another nod. "I see." The stilted conversation faltered. Eleanor turned her attention to the town passing by their wagon. Clearwater was larger than she had initially thought. Perhaps 30 buildings stretched along the main street, with smaller lanes branching off. A church steeple rose in the distance, and various shops advertised everything from hardware to millinery. The Wallace Mercantile stood near the center of town, its windows displaying bolts of fabric and household goods. As they passed, Eleanor noticed the newly painted sign above the door. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Peterson Brothers General Store. The final confirmation of Herbert's betrayal made her throat tighten. Mason must have noticed her distress, for he reached into his pocket and produced yet another note, pre-written as if he'd anticipated her situation. "The eastbound train comes through on Thursdays and Sundays." The kindness of offering this information away home nearly undid her composure. "Thank you," she managed, blinking rapidly, "but I can't. That is, I don't have the means for a return ticket." Mason regarded her for a long moment, then nodded once in understanding before returning his attention to the road. They turned onto a side street lined with neat wooden houses, stopping before a 2-story building with a small porch and window boxes awaiting spring flowers. Mrs. Byrne proved to be a brisk, practical woman in her 50s, with graying auburn hair and shrewd eyes that assessed Eleanor thoroughly. "So Herbert Wallace left you high and dry, did he?" she asked after Eleanor explained her situation. "Can't say I'm surprised. Never did trust a man with pomade in his hair." She shook her head disapprovingly. "Well, you can stay here tonight. But I'll need payment in advance come morning. 50 cents a night includes breakfast and dinner." Eleanor's stomach sank. At that rate, her $5 would last barely more than a week. "Do you know if there's any work available in town? I'm educated. I can keep accounts, and I've taught school before." "Teaching positions filled by the Reverend's daughter," Mrs. Byrne replied. "As for other work," she considered, "Peterson Brothers might need help at the store, though I hear they're bringing in someone from Butte. The hotel sometimes needs chambermaids, but the pay's poor and the hours worse." Mason, who had been unloading a crate of supplies from his wagon, approached with a folded paper. He handed it to his aunt rather than Eleanor. Mrs. Byrne read it, her eyebrows rising. "Mason says his housekeeper left last month. He needs someone to cook and clean at the ranch." She gave Eleanor an evaluating look. "Pays $30 a month plus room and board." The offer was unexpected and troubling. "I couldn't possibly. That is, it wouldn't be proper. A single woman living at a bachelor's ranch?" Mrs. Byrne snorted. "This isn't Boston, Miss Mitchell. Out here, practical concerns outweigh social niceties. Besides, I'd vouch for Mason's character with my life. He's the most honorable man in the territory." Mason scribbled another note and handed it directly to Eleanor this time. "The foreman and his wife live on the property. You would have your own cabin. No impropriety." The offer was tempting. $30 a month would allow her to save for a train ticket home, or wherever she decided to go next. Still, the prospect of leaving town with a man she'd just met, regardless of his aunt's endorsement, gave her pause. "I need to consider it," she finally said. "May I let you know tomorrow, Mr. Hayes?" He nodded, seeming neither disappointed nor particularly invested in her answer. After a brief exchange of notes with his aunt, he tipped his hat to Eleanor and departed, leaving her to follow Mrs. Byrne into the boarding house. The room was small, but clean, with a narrow bed, washstand and hook for her clothing. After a simple dinner with Mrs. Byrne and her two other boarders, a young clerk from the bank and an elderly man who manned the telegraph office, Eleanor retreated to her room and the privacy to finally release the tears she'd been suppressing. Since learning of Herbert's betrayal, the humiliation burned nearly as much as the fear. How could she have been so naive? The signs had been there in his letters. The questions about her savings, the vague responses when she'd asked about the details of their future life. She'd ignored them, so desperate to escape her circumstances that she'd willfully blinded herself to the possibility of deception. By morning, pragmatism had replaced self-pity. Eleanor paid Mrs. Byrne for 3 nights' lodging and set out to inquire about employment possibilities. The Peterson brothers had indeed hired a distant cousin to help at the store. The hotel had no openings. The saloon offered possibilities she refused to consider. By midday, she had exhausted her options and found herself once again on Mrs. Byrne's porch, contemplating Mason Hayes's offer. "He'll be by again tomorrow morning," Mrs. Byrne informed her, over a simple lunch of bread and stew. "Ranch is only 5 miles out, if you're wondering. Close enough to town for church on Sundays, if you're so inclined." "How did he lose his voice?" Eleanor asked, curiosity finally overcoming propriety. Mrs. Byrne's expression softened. "Battle of Petersburg, near the end of the war. Mason served with the Montana Volunteers. Never heard the full story. He doesn't like to write about it. And his sister Kate only told me that a shell exploded too close. Took his voice and left that scar, but he was luckier than most of his unit. How does he manage the ranch without being able to speak? Notepad for complex matters, hand signals for the rest. His foreman, Joe Turner, has worked with him since before the war and can practically read his mind. The hands respect him. He works alongside them and pays fair." Mrs. Byrne studied Eleanor thoughtfully. "You're worried about the arrangement." It wasn't a question. "Yes," Eleanor admitted. "I came west expecting marriage, not domestic service in a stranger's home. If it's marriage you're set on, Tom Peterson, the older brother, is widowed with 2 young children. Been making eyes at every unmarried woman in 3 counties. Mrs. Byrne's frank assessment was delivered without judgment. "Or there's Michael Donahue at the livery, though he drinks more than is wise. Frontier towns always need women, Miss Mitchell." "You have options beyond Mason's offer." The matter-of-fact suggestion of alternative suitors made Eleanor blush. "I hardly think. That is, I'm not looking to throw myself at the first available man," Mrs. Byrne chuckled. "Didn't suggest you should, just laying out the landscape." She collected their empty bowls. "Think of Mason's offer overnight. Whatever you decide, you'll need something to sustain you until the next eastbound train, if that's your plan." That evening, Eleanor sat on the boarding house porch, watching as Clearwater settled into twilight. Lamps glowed in windows, and from the saloon at the end of the street came the faint sounds of a piano. In just 24 hours, her perspective had shifted dramatically. The town that had initially seemed like the end of civilization now represented safety compared to the unknown quantity of Mason Hayes's ranch. Yet there was something about the silent rancher that had left an impression. His careful distance, the precise economy of his gestures, the directness of his gaze, all suggested a man accustomed to being understood without words. She recalled his hands, strong but gentle, when helping her into the wagon, and the scar that told of sacrifice. In a war that had ended many lives and altered countless others, by morning her decision was made. Practical considerations outweighed romantic notions or social conventions. When Mason's wagon appeared outside the boarding house after breakfast, Eleanor was waiting with her valise packed and her bill settled. He raised an eyebrow in question. As she approached, "I've decided to accept your offer, Mr. Hayes," she said firmly, "for a trial period of 1 month. If either of us finds the arrangement unsuitable after that time, I'll return to town with 2 weeks' wages." Mason nodded, then handed her a folded paper. "Agreed. Your duties include cooking, cleaning the main house, laundry, and tending the kitchen garden. Sundays are free except for feeding chickens." The businesslike terms reassured her. This was an employment arrangement, not charity or something more questionable. Mason loaded her valise, then assisted her onto the wagon bench with the same respectful care he'd shown the previous day. As they left Clearwater behind, Eleanor found herself studying the landscape with new eyes. The territory that had seemed so forbidding from the train window now revealed subtle beauties. Meadows dotted with early wildflowers, stands of pine trees that climbed the distant foothills, and a vast sky that seemed to encompass possibilities, rather than emptiness. Mason drove with the relaxed confidence of someone traversing familiar terrain. Occasionally he would point out features with a brief gesture: a hawk circling above, a creek that bordered his property, a cluster of deer grazing in the distance. Though no words passed between them, Eleanor found the silence surprisingly comfortable. The Double H Ranch appeared after they crested a gentle rise, a collection of well-maintained buildings nestled in a valley protected by surrounding hills. The main house was larger than Eleanor had expected, a 2-story structure built of squared logs, with a covered porch wrapping around 3 sides. Several smaller cabins, a large barn, and various outbuildings completed the settlement, which hummed with the activity of a working ranch. As they approached, a woman emerged from one of the cabins, stout, middle-aged, with a friendly face partially obscured by wisps of grey-streaked hair escaping her bun. She waved enthusiastically as the wagon drew near. "You must be Miss Mitchell. I'm Emma Turner, Joe's wife. So glad Mason found someone to help with the house. Been doing what I could between my own duties, but it's too much for one person with the spring calving underway." Her welcome tumbled out in a rush of warmth that immediately set Eleanor at ease. Mason jumped down from the wagon and offered Eleanor his hand. As she descended, Emma continued her cheerful monologue. "We've got your cabin all ready. It's the old foreman's place, just behind the main house. Nothing fancy but sound and clean. I put fresh linens on the bed and filled the wood box. You'll take your meals at the main house, I expect, but there's a small cook stove if you want tea or such." Mason nodded confirmation of these arrangements, then gestured toward the main house with a questioning look at Eleanor. "Yes, I'd like to see my duties," she interpreted, finding his meaning surprisingly clear despite his silence. The main house revealed itself to be comfortably appointed, if somewhat neglected. The furnishings were of good quality, a mix of pieces that appeared to have been shipped from the East and sturdier items of local craftsmanship. What it lacked was a woman's touch. Dust had accumulated on higher surfaces, curtains hung unevenly at windows, and the kitchen showed signs of bachelor cooking, utilitarian and minimal. Mason's sister Kate used to visit regular and get things properly sorted, Emma explained as they toured the rooms. But since she married that doctor from Helena 3 years back, She only comes for Christmas. Mason manages for himself most. And days, but a proper house needs proper keeping. Eleanor assessed the work critically. Nothing appeared insurmountable, just the standard cleaning, cooking and organizing that any household required. The kitchen was well stocked with basic provisions, and a pump at the sink meant water wouldn't need to be carried from an outdoor well. "I can certainly manage this," she concluded aloud. Mason, who had been following silently, nodded once in apparent approval. "Supper's at 6, Emma informed her. "I'll leave you to get settled in your cabin. Joe and the hands eat at the bunkhouse, but Mason takes his meals here. Just the two of you for most, unless there's company." The realization that she would be dining alone with her employer each day gave Ellen a momentary pause, but she reminded herself of Mrs. Byrne's endorsement and the practical realities of frontier life. Social conventions that seemed immutable in Pennsylvania bent under the weight of necessity in Montana Territory. Her cabin proved to be a pleasantly surprising sanctuary. A single room with a curtained-off sleeping area, small sitting space, with 2 comfortable chairs, a functional cook stove, and shelves holding a dozen well-worn books. Light streamed through windows on 2 walls, and someone had placed a vase of fresh wildflowers on the small table. Once alone, Eleanor sank into one of the chairs, overwhelmed by the rapid changes in her circumstances. 48 hours ago, she had been anticipating marriage to Herbert Wallace and a settled life managing a mercantile. Now she was miles from town, employed as housekeeper to a man who couldn't speak, facing a future as uncertain as the Montana weather. Yet as she unpacked her meager belongings, Eleanor felt something unexpected beneath the anxiety and lingering humiliation, a curious sense of possibility. Perhaps, she reflected, as she smoothed her apron in preparation for preparing her first meal at the Double H Ranch, fate had a different plan than the one she had so carefully arranged through matrimonial advertisements and hopeful letters. And, perhaps, just this once, fate's revision might prove better than her original draft. Eleanor woke before dawn on her first full day at the Double H Ranch, momentarily disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings. The cabin's small window framed a sky just beginning to lighten, stars fading as indigo gave way to the first pale streaks of morning. For a moment, she lay still, cataloguing the strange symphony of sounds, distant lowing of cattle, the soft whickering of horses in the nearby barn, and the persistent chirping of early birds greeting the new day. These were not the sounds of Pennsylvania, nor were they the rhythmic clickety-clack of train wheels that had filled her ears for the past week. This was Montana Territory. Her new reality, at least temporarily. Rising briskly, Eleanor pumped cold water into the wash basin and performed her morning ablutions with efficient movements. There would be time for self-pity later if she chose to indulge it. For now, duty called in the form of breakfast preparation at the main house. The pre-dawn air carried a chill that penetrated her shawl as she crossed the short distance from her cabin. Inside, the ranch house stood silent and cold. Eleanor busied herself lighting the kitchen stove, finding satisfaction in the practical task of coaxing flames from kindling and watching the iron surfaces begin to radiate heat. By the time she had coffee brewing and biscuit dough mixed, the kitchen had transformed into a warm sanctuary against the morning chill. She was slicing bacon when a floorboard creaked behind her. Eleanor turned to find Mason Hayes watching from the doorway, already dressed for the day's work in sturdy denims and a flannel shirt. His expression gave nothing away, but he nodded at her in silent greeting. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," she responded, striving for a businesslike tone. "Breakfast will be ready shortly. Do you eat eggs with your bacon?" He held up 2 fingers, then made a circular motion with his hand. 2 eggs over easy? Eleanor guessed, pleased when he nodded confirmation. "Coffee is ready if you'd like some." While you wait, Mason helped himself to coffee, moving around the kitchen with the ease of long familiarity. He settled at the table near the window, withdrawing a small notebook from his pocket. While Eleanor finished preparing breakfast, he occasionally paused from his writing to sip his coffee, his presence oddly companionable, despite the silence. When she placed his plate before him, he handed her a neatly written note. "I leave at dawn most days, back for midday dinner when possible, always return for supper by 6. Sundays are quieter. Any questions about your duties?" "None at present," Eleanor replied. "I'll spend today assessing what needs to be done and establishing a routine." She hesitated, then added, "Is there anything in particular you prefer for your meals?" Mason considered. This, then wrote, "Not fussy. Meat and potatoes satisfy. Garden behind the house has early greens now. Root cellar fully stocked." Eleanor nodded, mentally cataloguing the information. "And laundry? Is there a specific day for washing?" Another note. "Monday, traditional. Emma can show you where everything is kept." The practical exchange established a comfortable rhythm that continued through breakfast. Mason ate with the hearty appetite of a working man, but maintained the table manners of a gentleman. When he'd finished, he rose and wrote a final note before donning his hat and coat. "Dinner at noon if I'm here. Don't wait past 12:30. Joe can answer any questions if I'm absent." Left alone, Eleanor surveyed the kitchen with a critical eye. It was functional, but disorganized, with utensils and supplies scattered haphazardly in various drawers and cupboards. A thorough cleaning and reorganization would be her first order of business. She worked steadily through the morning, finding unexpected satisfaction in bringing order to chaos. By mid-morning, the kitchen gleamed with polish, utensils hung in logical places, and the pantry had been inventoried and reorganized. The physical labor allowed her mind to process recent events without spiraling into despair. Each scrubbed surface represented a small victory over circumstances, a reminder that while she couldn't control Herbert Wallace's deception or her stranded state, she could control her response to it. A tentative knock at the back door interrupted her cleaning of the main sitting room. Emma Turner stood on the porch, her round face flushed from exertion. "Thought you might appreciate some company and advice," she offered cheerfully. "First day in a new place can be overwhelming." Eleanor welcomed the older woman gratefully. Emma's practical knowledge of the ranch operation proved invaluable as she explained the rhythms of ranch life. The spring carving that kept the men busy from dawn to dusk, the anticipated arrival of additional hands for summer grazing season, and the social dynamics of the small community. "Mason keeps to himself mostly," Emma explained as they walked the property. "Not from unfriendliness, just his way, even before the war took his voice. His father started this ranch 30 years ago, when this was barely settled territory. Mason grew up learning ranching alongside Joe and some of the other old-timers. Went off to war in '64 when things were looking grim for the Union. Came back, changed, as they all did, but with more visible marks than some. Mrs. Byrne mentioned he was injured at Petersburg," Eleanor ventured, curiosity outweighing propriety. Emma nodded. "Near the end of the fighting, shell exploded right beside him, from what Joe heard. Piece of metal sliced clean through his throat. Army surgeon saved his life but couldn't save his voice." She shook her head sadly. 2 more weeks, and he'd have been home safe, war nearly over. That's fate for you, cruel and fickle." They paused at the kitchen garden, where early spring greens pushed through rich soil in neat rows. "Mason's father died while he was away fighting," Emma continued. "His mother passed the winter before he enlisted. Sister Kate managed as best she could during the war years, but it was Mason who built the ranch back up when he returned. Worked twice as hard as any man with a voice, as if to prove his worth hadn't diminished with his injury." Eleanor absorbed this information with growing interest. The silent rancher was developing dimensions beyond her initial impression, a man shaped by loss and perseverance, whose method of communication might be unconventional, but whose character spoke volumes. Their tour ended at the chicken coop, where Emma demonstrated the feeding routine that would be part of Eleanor's daily responsibilities. "Fresh eggs are the best payment for the trouble," she noted, collecting several warm eggs from nesting boxes. "These will do nicely for dinner. Mason especially likes them in custard, though he'd never ask for such an extravagance." When noon arrived, Eleanor had prepared a hearty meal of baked ham, early greens from the garden, and fresh bread. But Mason didn't appear. Following his instructions, she waited until 12:30 before covering his portion and leaving, it warming on the back of the stove. The afternoon passed and continued cleaning and organization. By the time Eleanor began preparing supper, she had thoroughly surveyed her domain and developed a mental inventory of tasks requiring attention. The house, while solidly built and well-furnished, reflected years of bachelor neglect. Curtains needing mending, rugs requiring beating, and woodwork desperately in need of polish. Mason returned just as dusk settled across the valley. Eleanor heard the heavy front door open and close, followed by the sound of boots being removed in the mud room. When he entered the kitchen, she noted the fatigue evident in the set of his shoulders and the smudges of dirt on his clothing. "Supper will be ready shortly," she informed him. "There's hot water for washing up." He nodded gratefully, then disappeared to make himself presentable. When he returned, freshly washed and wearing a clean shirt, Eleanor had the table set with a hearty meal of roast beef, potatoes, and the custard Emma had suggested. Mason's eyebrows rose slightly at the dessert, a small but noticeable reaction that pleased Eleanor more than she would have expected. He wrote a brief note. "You've been busy. House already looks different." "There's much still to be done," Eleanor replied, finding it increasingly natural to converse with his written responses. "But progress was made. I hope the meal is to your liking." They ate in companionable silence. Eleanor had anticipated awkwardness in dining alone with her employer, but Mason's calm presence and evident appreciation for her cooking created an unexpectedly comfortable atmosphere. When he finished the custard, a hint of a smile softened his usually stoic expression. He wrote, "Haven't had this since Kate left." "Thank you." "You're welcome," Eleanor responded, warmed by the simple gratitude. "Your sister taught you to appreciate." "Custard," Mason nodded, then wrote more. "Mother's recipe, Sunday tradition before the war." The small personal detail, offered voluntarily, felt significant somehow. Eleanor found herself curious about the man behind the silence, wondering what other memories and preferences remain unexpressed behind his reserved exterior. As days melded into weeks, Eleanor established routines that transformed both the house and her place within it. The initial strangeness of communicating with Mason gradually gave way to a surprisingly effective system. For simple matters, she learned to interpret his gestures and expressions, while his notebook handled more complex exchanges. Occasionally, when a subject required extended discussion, he would write longer notes in the evening and leave them for her to find in the morning. Through these written exchanges and Emma's occasional commentary, Eleanor pieced together a fuller picture of her employer. Mason Hayes had been educated in Helena before the war, returning with plans to expand his father's modest operation into one of the territory's significant cattle producers. The conflict had interrupted those plans, and his injury had complicated their execution, but his determination remained undiminished. The Double H now ran several hundred head of cattle, employed 8 full-time hands, and had established a reputation for quality that brought buyers from as far as Chicago. Spring advanced into early summer, bringing longer days filled with activity. As the ranch prepared for the summer grazing season, additional hands arrived, nearly doubling the number of men requiring meals. Eleanor found herself rising before dawn to prepare massive breakfasts and spending afternoons baking enough bread and pies to satisfy hearty frontier appetites. "Never seen the men so eager for mealtime," Joe Turner commented with a wink when he stopped by the kitchen one afternoon. "Mason struck gold finding you, Miss Mitchell. Last fellow who tried cooking nearly poisoned half the crew with his biscuits." Eleanor blushed at the compliment. "I'm glad to contribute something valuable to the operation." "More than valuable," Joe assured her. "Mason's actually gained back some of the weight he lost last winter. Man works himself too hard, always has. Seems more settled since you arrived." The observation lingered in Eleanor's thoughts as she went about her duties. She had noticed subtle changes in Mason's demeanor over the weeks. The increasing frequency of his almost smiles at the dinner table, his tendency to linger over evening coffee rather than immediately retiring to his office, the occasional wildflower or interesting stone he would leave on the kitchen windowsill after his daily rounds. One particularly fine June evening, a sunset painted the western sky in spectacular hues. Eleanor sat on the front porch steps, shelling peas for the next day's dinner. The rhythmic task allowed her thoughts to wander homeward, contemplating what her life might have been had she remained in Pennsylvania. Would she have eventually found a teaching position, accepted Cousin Martha's grudging offer of permanent residence as an unpaid nursemaid to her children, or perhaps succumbed to the increasingly insistent attentions of Martha's husband, trading dignity for security? The creak of the porch boards announced Mason's presence before his shadow fell across her work. He settled on the step beside her, maintaining a respectful distance while withdrawing his ever-present notebook. "Letter came for you today," he wrote, producing an envelope from his shirt pocket. "Ryder brought mail from town." Eleanor accepted it with surprise. The envelope bore her name in a familiar flowing script, her friend Charlotte from Pennsylvania. "Thank you," she murmured, setting aside the peas to open this unexpected connection to her past life. Charlotte's letter contained the usual small-town news, births, deaths, and marriages that once would have seemed momentous, but now felt distant and slightly unreal. The final paragraph, however, sent a chill through Eleanor despite the warm evening air. "Your cousin Martha's husband has been asking after your whereabouts most persistently. He claims concern for your welfare, but something in his manner suggests less honorable motives. I've told him only that you traveled west for employment with no specifics. Be cautious if you correspond with Martha's household. I fear that man harbors unwholesome intentions." Eleanor folded the letter with trembling fingers. The Montana sunset suddenly seemed less beautiful, the peaceful ranch less secure. James. Cooper had found her once before, cornering her in Martha's pantry with wandering hands and whispered promises of protection in exchange for unnamed favors. His persistence suggested a fixation that distance alone might not discourage. Mason watched her reaction with evident concern. When she remained silent, he wrote, "Bad news." "Not exactly," Eleanor hedged, reluctant to burden him with her personal troubles. "Just a reminder of why I left Pennsylvania." Mason's penetrating gaze suggested he sensed there was more to the story, but he didn't press. Instead, he wrote, "Sunday tomorrow. No regular duties except chickens. Rest if you wish." The consideration touched her. "Thank you. I might walk up to the ridge if the weather holds. Emma mentioned the view is particularly fine this time of year." Mason nodded, then wrote, "Be careful of rattlesnakes in the rocks. Take a walking stick from the porch rack." The practical concern for her safety, expressed without overstepping boundaries, exemplified what Eleanor had come to appreciate about Mason Hayes. In the 6 weeks since arriving at the Double H, she had never once felt the discomfort or vulnerability that had been her constant companion in Martha's household. Mason's silence, far from being unsettling, had become a form of respect, space within which she could exist without constant explanation or justification. The following morning dawned clear and perfect for Eleanor's planned excursion. After feeding the chickens and leaving a cold dinner prepared for Mason, she set out toward the ridge that formed the ranch's eastern boundary. The early summer landscape burst with life. Wildflowers carpeted meadows in purple and yellow blooms, songbirds darted between stands of aspen, and the distant mountains stood sharp and clear against the azure sky. The climb proved more strenuous than anticipated, but the effort cleared Eleanor's mind of lingering shadows from Charlotte's letter. By the time she reached the ridge's crest, perspiration dampened her collar despite the relatively cool air. She settled on a flat rock, breathing deeply as she surveyed the panoramic vista below. The Double H spread across the valley in orderly patterns. Fenced pastures, the cluster of buildings forming the main compound, the glint of the creek winding through willows. Beyond the ranch boundaries, the land stretched toward distant mountains, wild and largely untouched by human presence. The vastness inspired both awe and melancholy, reminding Eleanor of her own insignificance in this grand landscape. A woman, with no true home, temporarily sheltered by circumstance and a silent man's generosity. Movement in the valley below caught her attention. A rider on a distinctive Palomino horse, Mason, she realized, was returning from the northern pastures. He rode with the easy grace of someone who had spent a lifetime in the saddle, becoming almost an extension of the animal beneath him. Even at a distance, his solitary figure conveyed strength and purpose. Watching him, Eleanor confronted a truth she had been avoiding in recent weeks. Her feelings toward Mason Hayes had evolved beyond employee to employer. She admired his quiet competence, his evident integrity, the respect he commanded without words among his men. More disconcertingly, she had begun to anticipate their silent meals together, to value the rare moments when his serious expression softened into an almost smile, to treasure the small gestures of consideration that punctuated their daily interactions. Such feelings were impractical at best, foolish at worst. Mason had offered employment, not courtship. His kindness represented the decency of his character, not particular interest in a stranded mail-order bride with few options. The sensible course would be to continue working, saving her wages for eventual independence, and guarding her heart against romantic notions born of proximity and gratitude. Yet, as she watched him disappear into the barn below, Eleanor acknowledged that sensible courses had never brought her happiness. She had sensibly accepted James Cooper's arrangement of the match with Herbert Wallace. She had sensibly agreed to travel thousands of miles to marry a stranger. Perhaps sensibility was overrated. The thought accompanied her down the ridge. Persistence, growing with each step toward the ranch buildings. By the time she reached her cabin, a resolution had formed. Not yet fully articulated, but gathering strength beneath her practical exterior. She would complete her 3-month probationary period at the Double H, establishing herself as irreplaceable in the ranch's operation, and then, perhaps, she would find the courage to determine whether Mason Hayes might consider an arrangement more permanent than housekeeper and employer. The opportunity to test this resolution arrived sooner than anticipated. As Eleanor approached her cabin, she spotted an unfamiliar buggy outside the main house. Curiosity quickened her steps across the yard, where Emma intercepted her with evident excitement. "You've just missed the excitement," the older woman reported, breathlessly. "Tom Peterson rode out from town with news. Big cattle buyer from Chicago, arriving next week. Wants to purchase for the railroads heading east. Could mean the biggest contract Double H has ever seen." Eleanor absorbed this information, understanding its significance for the ranch's prosperity. "That's wonderful news. I imagine Mr. Hayes is pleased," That's just it, Emma continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially. This buyer and his wife will stay 3 days inspecting the operation. They're prominent Chicago society. Expect certain refinements. She hesitated. Mason needs the main house prepared for entertaining, formal dinners, social conversation. Her expression conveyed the obvious challenge this presented for a host who couldn't speak. Understanding dawned. He needs assistance with hosting duties. Emma nodded vigorously. Exactly. Joe suggested Mason might ask if you would, well, act as hostess, help create the proper impression. She rushed to add, just for business purposes, of course. The opportunity is too important to risk losing over social awkwardness. The request, not yet formally made by Mason himself, represented both opportunity and complication. Acting as hostess would temporarily elevate her from servant to partner, allowing her to demonstrate skills beyond cooking and cleaning. Yet it would also blur the clear boundaries of her employment, potentially creating confusion about her position. Before Eleanor could formulate a response, the front door opened and Mason appeared on the porch. His expression, when he caught sight of her, contained an uncharacteristic uncertainty. In his hand was his notebook, a pencil poised as if he'd been composing a difficult message. Emma discreetly withdrew, leaving Eleanor at the bottom of the porch steps looking up at her silent employer. The moment stretched between them, filled with unasked questions and unexplored possibilities. Finally, Mason began to write. The page, when he handed it to her, contained a single question that would alter the careful balance of their arrangement. Would you consider helping me host the Whitfields next week? Not as a housekeeper, but as partner. I cannot offer appropriate hospitality alone. Eleanor looked from the page to Mason's face, recognizing the cost to his pride that such a request represented. The man who had built a successful ranch without speaking a word now acknowledged a limitation he couldn't overcome through sheer determination. The vulnerability in his usually stoic expression touched something deep within her. Yes, Mr. Hayes, she replied quietly. I would be honored to help. The relief that crossed his features was quickly masked, but not before Eleanor glimpsed genuine gratitude in his blue eyes. He wrote again, more rapidly. Thank you. We should discuss arrangements. After supper? Eleanor nodded, already mentally, cataloguing what would be needed. Linens for the guest room, ingredients for formal meals, her own suitable attire for hosting duties. The practical concerns helped distract from the implications of this new development in their relationship. As she turned toward her cabin to freshen up before preparing supper, Eleanor found herself repeatedly touching the folded note in her pocket. One simple word in that message lingered in her thoughts, carrying weight far beyond its 4 letters. Partner. For the first time since stepping off the train at Clearwater Station, Eleanor felt something beyond resignation or practical acceptance of her circumstances, something dangerously close to hope. The week before the Whitfields' arrival transformed the Double H Ranch into a flurry of activity. Eleanor found herself at the center of preparations, directing a thorough cleaning of the main house while planning menus elaborate enough to impress Chicago socialites, yet practical enough to prepare in a frontier kitchen. Each evening after supper, she and Mason would sit at the kitchen table, notebooks open between them, discussing arrangements with an intensity that reflected the visit's importance to the ranch's future. The guest room needs new curtains, Eleanor noted on Wednesday evening, mentally cataloguing the space's deficiencies. The current ones are faded beyond respectability. Mason nodded, writing quickly, Order whatever you need from Clearwater. Joe rides in tomorrow. There isn't time for ordering. I'll need to make them. Eleanor tapped her pencil thoughtfully against the table. Does your sister leave any fabric in the house? Something suitable? Mason's expression shifted subtly. Surprise followed by consideration. He rose and gestured for Eleanor to follow him upstairs to a room she had cleaned but never closely examined, Kate's former bedroom, maintained in anticipation of her infrequent visits. Inside, Mason crossed to a cedar chest beneath the window and opened it, revealing neatly folded textiles. He withdrew several lengths of fabric, presenting them for Eleanor's inspection with a questioning look. "These are perfect," she confirmed, running her fingers over a rich cream-colored cotton, with a subtle pattern, more than enough for curtains, and perhaps a new tablecloth as well. She glanced at Mason, noting the faint shadow that crossed his features as he surveyed his sister's preserved room. "Are you certain Kate won't mind?" He wrote briefly, "She'd approve of their use. Practical woman, my sister, the shared moment." Mason revealing something personal, Eleanor gaining insight into the family dynamics that had shaped him, added another thread to the complex tapestry of their developing relationship. More and more, Eleanor found herself collecting these small revelations about the silent rancher, his preference for coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, his habit of reading Shakespeare by lamplight on Sunday evenings, the gentle way he handled the barn cats that kept mice from the grain storage. Thursday brought an unexpected complication in the form of a driving rainstorm that transformed the ranch yard into mud and delayed critical preparation of the grounds. Eleanor, up to her elbows in bread dough, watched through the kitchen window as Mason and his men worked in the downpour, reinforcing a sagging fence near the main barn. "Stubborn as granite, that man," Emma observed when she stopped by with fresh eggs. Joe told him they could wait for better weather, but Mason insists everything must be perfect when the Whitfields arrive. She shook her head fondly. "Always been that way, determined to prove the ranch measures up to any standards, Eastern or otherwise." "It's admirable," Eleanor replied, punching down the dough with perhaps more force than necessary. "His dedication to building something worthwhile." Emma studied her with shrewd eyes. "Dedication is well and good, but a body needs balance. Ranch has been Mason's whole life since he returned from the war. Man needs more than cattle and fence posts to make a full existence." The observation lingered with Eleanor throughout the afternoon as she sewed curtains at the kitchen table. By the time Mason returned, soaked to the skin and mud-splattered but satisfied with the day's progress, she had reached a decision about the upcoming dinner with the Whitfields. "We should practice," she announced as he dried himself by the kitchen stove. Mason's quizzical expression prompted explanation. "The dinner party," Eleanor clarified. "We should rehearse how we'll manage conversation and hosting duties with your communication constraints." She hesitated, concerned about causing offense, but Mason's expression remained open. "I've been considering how to make things flow naturally. If we establish some signals in advance, I can help facilitate discussions without drawing attention to the methods." Mason considered this, then nodded decisively before writing, "Practical approach. What do you suggest?" Over a simple supper of beef stew and biscuits, Eleanor outlined her strategy. "I'll take the conversational lead when appropriate, but we need a way for you to indicate when you have something specific to contribute." She demonstrated a subtle gesture, 3 fingers tapped lightly against the table. "You could signal me, then write your thoughts while I keep the conversation going. I'll find a natural moment to incorporate your comment." Mason tested the signal, his eyes never leaving hers as his fingers tapped the wooden tabletop. The intensity of his gaze sent an unexpected warmth through Eleanor's chest. She cleared her throat, continuing with forced practicality. "For yes, and no questions, perhaps just a nod or head shake would be most natural. And if you need to direct conversation to a specific topic—" She trailed off as Mason began writing. "I appreciate your thoroughness," his note read. "Few would consider these details." "It's nothing extraordinary," Eleanor demurred. "Just practical planning." Mason shook his head slightly, writing again. Not just practical, kind, thoughtful. You make my silence less isolating. The simple admission, more personal than any previous exchange, hung between them in the quiet kitchen. Eleanor found herself unable to dismiss the compliment with her usual deflection. Your silence has never felt like a barrier to me, she admitted softly. Just a different way of communicating. Something flickered in Mason's eyes, surprise perhaps, or a deeper emotion she couldn't name. Before either could navigate this new territory, a knock at the kitchen door heralded Joe Turner with a telegram that required immediate attention. The moment passed, but its impact lingered in Eleanor's thoughts as she cleared the supper dishes. Friday dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for final preparations. Eleanor spent the morning directing a thorough cleaning of the seldom-used formal dining room, polishing silver that had tarnished from disuse, and arranging wildflowers in a crystal vase that Emma produced from a cupboard of special occasion items. After a quick midday dinner, Eleanor retreated to her cabin to address a pressing concern: her own appearance for the upcoming social obligation. Her limited wardrobe contained nothing suitable for playing hostess to wealthy Chicago visitors. Her best blue dress, already showing wear when she arrived in Montana, now bore the unmistakable marks of daily ranch work, despite careful maintenance. She was contemplating possible alterations to make it more presentable when a knock sounded at her door. Emma stood on the threshold, cradling a large package wrapped in brown paper. Special delivery, the older woman announced with barely suppressed excitement. From Mason. He rode to town at dawn and back again while you were busy with the dining room. Puzzled, Eleanor accepted the package and untied its string binding. Inside lay a dress of deep green wool, simply styled but of excellent quality, with mother-of-pearl buttons and delicate embroidery at collar and cuffs. Beneath it was a cream-colored shawl of soft cashmere, finer than anything Eleanor had ever owned. How did he, she began, running her fingers over the beautiful fabric, sent measurements to his sister in Helena by telegram yesterday, Emma explained. Kate arranged for these to be sent on the morning stage from her personal collection. They've never been worn, apparently ordered before her last child was born, then set aside when she discovered she was expecting. Emma's eyes twinkled. Mason was quite specific about the color, said it should match your eyes. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks at this revelation. The thoughtfulness of the gesture, Mason anticipating her need and finding a solution that preserved her dignity, touched her deeply. More significant was the personal consideration of selecting a color to complement her appearance, suggesting he had noticed her in ways beyond her role as housekeeper. It's too much, she protested weakly. Emma shook her head firmly. It's exactly appropriate for what he's asking you to do. You can't serve as hostess looking like household staff, and Mason knows it. Accept the gift in the spirit it's given, practical necessity with a touch of personal consideration. That evening, Eleanor found Mason in his office reviewing ledgers. She knocked softly on the open door, waiting for his acknowledgement before entering, a small courtesy that maintained the boundaries of their unusual relationship. I wanted to thank you for the dress, she said simply. It's beautiful and exactly what was needed for the dinner. Mason nodded, seeming almost embarrassed by her gratitude. He wrote briefly, Kate was happy to help. Green suits you. Still, it was thoughtful of you to arrange it. Eleanor hesitated, then added, I finished the new curtains for the guest room if you'd like to see them. The domestic detail offered safe territory after the more personal exchange, and Mason followed her upstairs to inspect the transformation of the guest quarters. The cream-colored curtains softened the room's masculine lines, complementing the polished wood furniture and fresh linens. A small vase of wildflowers on the bureau added a welcoming touch. Perfect, Mason wrote after. Surveying the space. Whitfield's arrive tomorrow afternoon. Everything ready? Nearly, Eleanor confirmed. The roast is prepared for Sunday dinner, breakfast provisions are organized, and I've planned an appropriate luncheon for their first day. The only remaining task is the final dusting in the morning. As they descended the stairs, Eleanor found herself hyper-aware of Mason's presence behind her, his measured footsteps, the slight scent of leather and pine that seemed to accompany him, the careful distance he maintained despite the narrow staircase. Their working relationship had developed a comfortable rhythm over the past weeks, but moments like this, alone in the quiet house as evening gathered, highlighted the unusual nature of their arrangement. In any conventional household, a single woman alone with her employer at night would risk her reputation at minimum. Yet at the Double H, the ordinary rules of society felt distant and somewhat irrelevant. What mattered was the understanding they had built, the mutual respect that guided their interactions. "I should return to my cabin," Eleanor said when they reached the front hall. "Morning will come early." Mason nodded, but made a small gesture requesting her to wait while he wrote one more note. "Thank you for all this work. The ranch's future may depend on making a good impression." "I understand the importance," Eleanor assured him. "We'll present everything in the best possible light." His next note surprised her. "Not just the ranch. Whitfield's opinion of me. People often assume—" He paused, pencil hovering over the paper before continuing, "that silence means simplicity of mind." The admission revealed a vulnerability Eleanor hadn't anticipated, that beneath Mason's capable exterior lurked the awareness of how others might perceive his disability. "Mr. Whitfield will recognize your intelligence and capability within minutes of meeting you," she said firmly. "Your ranch speaks to your competence far more eloquently than words could." Mason's expression softened at her assertion, the tension around his eyes easing. He wrote once more before she departed. "Good night, Eleanor." It was the first time he had addressed her by her given name in written form, though she had become Miss Eleanor to the ranch hands weeks ago. The small intimacy warmed her as she crossed the yard to her cabin beneath a canopy of brilliant stars. The Whitfields arrived the following afternoon in a hired carriage from Clearwater, their appearance causing a barely concealed stir among the ranch hands who happened to be in the yard. Walter Whitfield cut an imposing figure, tall, corpulent, and expensively dressed in a manner that seemed excessive for frontier travel. His wife Cordelia was his physical opposite, slender to the point of frailty, with sharp features and assessing eyes that missed nothing as Mason helped her descend from the carriage. Eleanor, wearing the green wool dress with her hair arranged more formally than usual, waited on the porch as introductions were made via Mason's written notes. Up close, she noted the calculating assessment in Walter Whitfield's gaze as he observed the ranch buildings and livestock visible from the yard. This was a man who had built his fortune through shrewd evaluation of assets, human and otherwise. "Charming," Cordelia pronounced, with the faintest hint of condescension as she surveyed the ranch house. "So rustic and authentic. One hardly feels civilization has intruded at all." Eleanor recognized the backhanded compliment for what it was, but maintained a pleasant expression. "The Double H combines frontier practicality with surprising comforts, Mrs. Whitfield. I believe you'll find your accommodations quite satisfactory." Cordelia's eyebrows rose slightly at Eleanor's refined speech. "And you are—" Before Eleanor could respond, Mason handed Whitfield a note which the businessman read aloud. "Miss Mitchell manages household affairs and will ensure your comfort during your stay." How convenient to have feminine influence in a bachelor establishment, Cordelia remarked with a glance between Eleanor and Mason that carried insinuation. One hears such stories about frontier living arrangements. The implication was unmistakable, and Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment but from indignation on Mason's behalf. Before she could formulate a response that balanced propriety with defense of her employer's honor, Mason handed her a discreetly written note. Tea in parlor, while rooms are prepared. Grateful for the direction, Eleanor smoothly suggested refreshments after their journey, guiding the conversation towards safer topics as she led the way inside. The afternoon unfolded in a careful dance of hospitality and business. Mason showed Walter around the immediate ranch buildings, while Eleanor entertained Cordelia with tea and fresh-baked scones in the parlor. The Chicago woman, once settled in relative comfort, revealed herself to be less haughty than her initial manner suggested, merely accustomed to a level of refinement that Montana Territory rarely provided. "You speak like an educated woman, Miss Mitchell," she observed, stirring her tea with precision. "How does one come to be managing household affairs on a remote cattle ranch?" The question demanded careful navigation. Eleanor provided an edited version of her journey west, omitting Herbert Wallace's deception and emphasizing the opportunity the Double H had provided. "Mr. Hayes runs an excellent operation," she concluded. "The position has proven most satisfactory." "And your relationship is strictly professional?" Cordelia pressed, her directness typical of Chicago social circles where time was too valuable for circumlocution. "Mr. Hayes is a gentleman of impeccable character," Eleanor replied evenly. "His injury prevents speech, but not integrity." Cordelia studied her with shrewd eyes. "Interesting. Most men I know speak constantly, yet possess little integrity." She sipped her tea thoughtfully. "My husband was eager to visit this ranch, based on reputation alone. The Hayes cattle consistently grade higher than competitors, and his business practices are reportedly beyond reproach." "Those assessments are entirely accurate," Eleanor confirmed, warming to the opportunity to advocate for Mason's operation. "Mr. Hayes maintains exacting standards in all aspects of his business. And yet," Cordelia mused, "he faces disadvantages in negotiating with men like my husband, who judge capability by forceful speech and commanding presence." She set down her cup with a decisive clink. "Perhaps you might offer insight, Miss Mitchell. How does a woman advocate for a worthy cause when males control the conversation? I imagine you've developed strategies, as has your employer." The unexpected alliance, woman to woman across social boundaries, caught Eleanor by surprise. Cordelia Whitfield, beneath her formal exterior, was offering both understanding and potential assistance in the upcoming negotiations. This was no empty social call, but a deliberate assessment from the influential woman behind Walter Whitfield's business decisions. "Mr. Hayes communicates with remarkable clarity despite his limitations," Eleanor replied carefully. "But yes, I've observed that some men mistake silence for weakness rather than recognizing the strength required to overcome such challenges." "Precisely," Cordelia agreed, with the first genuine smile since her arrival. "Walter respects determination. Above all else, the ability to overcome obstacles in pursuit of excellence." She lowered her voice confidentially. "Between us, Miss Mitchell, my husband has already decided to contract with Double H based on reputation alone. These 3 days are merely to confirm what he already believes, that Mr. Hayes runs the most reliable operation in the territory." The revelation eased some of Eleanor's anxiety about the visit, though not her determination to ensure everything proceeded perfectly. By the time Mason returned with Walter from their tour of the nearby pastures, she had established a tentative rapport with Cordelia that would serve them well during the remainder of the visit. Dinner that evening unfolded according to Eleanor's careful planning. She had selected a menu that balanced sophistication with regional character: a wild mushroom soup, followed by roasted venison with local vegetables and huckleberry cobbler for dessert. Mason, seated at the head of the table with Walter to his right and Cordelia to his left, maintained his dignity through the system they had rehearsed. Eleanor, positioned at the table's foot, facilitated conversation while watching for Mason's subtle signals when he wished to contribute. "The breeding program particularly impressed me," Walter commented as he savored the venison. "Superior bloodlines carefully developed. Hayes clearly thinks beyond immediate profits to long-term quality." Mason tapped 3 fingers discreetly against the tablecloth. While Eleanor kept the conversation flowing with a question about Chicago stockyards, he wrote a brief note and passed it to Walter. "Quality bloodlines require patience and selective investment," Walter read aloud. "Like any worthwhile enterprise." He nodded appreciatively. "Well said, Hayes. Too many ranchers focus on quantity over quality, flooding the market with mediocre stock." The evening progressed smoothly, with Eleanor guiding discussions toward topics that showcased Mason's expertise while allowing opportunities for written contributions that demonstrated his intelligence and business acumen. By the time coffee was served in the parlor, a comfortable rapport had developed among the 4 adults. As Eleanor served the coffee, she noticed Mason watching her with an expression she hadn't seen before, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, more personal. When she handed him his cup, their fingers brushed briefly, sending an unexpected current through her that momentarily disrupted her carefully maintained composure. "Miss Mitchell has been describing your remarkable journey, Mr. Hayes," Cordelia remarked, observing the exchange with interest. "Building this operation despite significant challenges after your war service. Most impressive." Mason inclined his head in acknowledgement, then wrote, "Had excellent help. Cannot claim sole credit." "Modest as well as capable," Walter commented. To his wife, "Rare combination in any businessman." He turned to Mason directly. "I believe we can establish a mutually beneficial arrangement, Hayes. We'll discuss specifics tomorrow, but I'm prepared to contract for your entire fall herd at premium rates." The declaration, earlier than anticipated and more definitive than hoped, represented a profound victory for the Double H. Eleanor felt a surge of pleasure at the success, especially observing the subtle relaxation in Mason's shoulders at this confirmation of his ranch's reputation. Later, after the Whitfields had retired to their room, Eleanor and Mason stood in the kitchen, the day's tension gradually dissipating in the familiar space. "That went remarkably well," Eleanor observed. Quietly, Mrs. Whitfield indicated they had essentially decided before arriving. Mason shook his head slightly, writing, "Your handling of the evening secured their confidence. Couldn't have managed without you." "We worked well together," Eleanor acknowledged, the collaborative achievement creating a warm sense of partnership. Mason hesitated, then wrote more slowly, "More than worked well. We complemented each other." The observation hung between them, laden with implications neither was quite ready to address. Eleanor busied herself with covering leftover dessert, while Mason wiped down the large kitchen table. The domestic tableau, comfortable, shared labor in companionable silence, embodied something Eleanor had never experienced in Pennsylvania, the foundation of potential partnership based on mutual respect and genuine appreciation. As she prepared to return to her cabin for the night, Mason handed her one final note. Unlike his usual brief communications, this one contained several carefully considered sentences. "Today made me realize what the ranch has lacked since my sister left. Not just feminine touches or social graces, but true partnership. You brought life back to this house, Eleanor. Thank you." The note trembled slightly in her hand as she read it, understanding that something fundamental had shifted between them. No longer merely employer and employee, they stood at the threshold of possibilities neither had anticipated when she stepped off the train at Clearwater Station just 2 months earlier. "Good night, Mr. Hayes." she said softly, her use of his formal name, a final maintenance of boundaries that felt increasingly artificial. The next morning's sunrise painted the Montana sky in spectacular hues, promising not just a beautiful day, but perhaps the beginning of something even more remarkable. At the Double H Ranch, the Whitfield's visit concluded with a flourish of success that rippled through the entire Double H operation. Walter signed a contract for the ranch's full autumn herd at prices that exceeded Mason's expectations, with provisions for first consideration of future stock. As the Chicago couple departed on Monday afternoon, Cordelia pressed a calling card into Eleanor's hand with a surprising invitation. "Should you ever find yourself in Chicago, my dear, you must call upon us," she said with unexpected warmth. "I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversations. One finds so few women of substance in these masculine territories." Eleanor accepted the card with genuine appreciation for this acknowledgement of her as a social equal rather than household staff. "You're very kind, Mrs. Whitfield." "Cordelia, please." The older woman glanced toward where Mason and Walter were concluding their business with handshakes. "Your Mr. Hayes is fortunate to have found you," she added in a lower voice. "My husband was thoroughly impressed by his operation, but equally impressed by the coordination between you. A successful partnership requires complementary strengths." Before Eleanor could correct the implication that Mason was her Mr. Hayes, Walter approached to usher his wife into the waiting carriage. Final pleasantries were exchanged, and the Whitfields departed in a cloud of dust, leaving Eleanor and Mason standing side by side on the porch. The success created a buoyant atmosphere that pervaded the ranch for days afterward. Joe Turner spread word of the contract terms among the hands, who celebrated with impromptu fiddle music and harmonica playing around the bunkhouse fire. Even Emma's usual practical demeanor gave way to satisfied pride as she helped Eleanor return the main house to its normal routines. "Biggest deal Double H has ever secured," she remarked, while they inventoried linens used during the visit. Mason's father would burst with pride if he could see what his son has built, war injury notwithstanding. For Eleanor, the visit's conclusion brought unexpected contemplation. Her role had temporarily transformed from housekeeper to something approaching an equal partner, and returning to her previous status felt increasingly artificial. Mason seemed to share this sentiment, evidenced by subtle changes in their daily interactions, seeking her opinion on ranch matters beyond household concerns, lingering over evening coffee in the kitchen, occasionally leaving books from his personal library on her cabin porch, with notes marking passages he thought might interest her. 2 weeks after the Whitfields' departure, opportunity for more direct communication presented itself when Mason left a note at breakfast. "Riding to North Pasture today to check fencing. Would welcome company if your duties permit." The invitation, their first potential outing together beyond ranch boundaries, carried significance Eleanor couldn't ignore. She spent the morning completing essential tasks with efficient haste, then changed into her riding skirt and sturdy boots before meeting Mason at the appointed time. He waited by the corral with 2 saddled horses, his Palomino gelding and a gentle bay mare that the hands sometimes used for checking fence lines. When Eleanor approached, he handed her a neatly written note. "Thought you might enjoy seeing more of the property. 4-hour ride approximately." "I'd like that very much," she replied, accepting his assistance into the saddle with practiced ease. 2 months of occasional riding lessons from Emma had given her basic competence, though she lacked the fluid grace Mason displayed as he mounted his own horse. They rode in companionable silence, following a well-worn trail that wound through meadows vibrant with late summer wildflowers before ascending gradually into pine-covered hills. The day was perfect for riding, Warm sunshine tempered by occasional cloud cover and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of sage and pine. Eleanor found herself relaxing into the rhythm of her mount's steady pace, appreciating the opportunity to see more of the land that had become her temporary home. Mason rode slightly ahead, occasionally pointing out features of interest. A hawk's nest high in a dead pine, fresh elk tracks crossing their path, the distant outline of mountains that marked the territory's western boundary. Though no words passed between them, Eleanor felt none of the awkwardness that might have accompanied such silence with another companion. They had developed their own language of gestures, expressions, and written notes that rendered constant speech unnecessary. At midday they reached a high meadow overlooking the valley where the main ranch buildings nestled like toys in the distance. Mason dismounted and helped Eleanor from her horse before retrieving a small pack from his saddle. Inside was a simple picnic: bread, cheese, dried apple slices, and a canteen of cool water, which he spread on a flat rock with a questioning look. "Perfect," Eleanor assured him, settling on a sun-warmed boulder while surveying the spectacular vista. "I had no idea the ranch extended so far or included such beautiful terrain." Mason nodded, writing briefly. "Nearly 5,000 acres, most inherited from father, some purchased after war." "It's magnificent," Eleanor said sincerely. "You've built something truly impressive here, Mr. Hayes." He shook his head slightly, then wrote, "Mason, please, after Whitfield's, formality seems unnecessary." The invitation to use his given name, another small but significant shift in their relationship, warmed Eleanor more than the summer sun. "Mason," she acknowledged with a smile, "though you should know your aunt maintains that such familiarity is scandalous." His eyes crinkled with rare humor as he wrote, "Emma believes anything past 1860 is scandalous. Still disapproves of women wearing riding boots." Their shared laughter created a moment of connection that lingered as they enjoyed their simple meal. Afterward, while Eleanor gathered the picnic remnants, Mason walked to the meadow's edge, his tall figure silhouetted against the brilliant blue sky. Something in his posture, a slight tension in his shoulders, the way he repeatedly touched the scar at his throat, suggested internal struggle. When he returned, his expression had grown serious again. He handed Eleanor a carefully written note, longer than his usual brief communications. "Have been meaning to explain more about my circumstances. You deserve to know whose employment you accepted." Eleanor set aside the picnic pack, recognizing the importance of this unexpected confidence. "I'm happy to listen," she said simply. Mason sat beside her on the boulder, maintaining a respectful distance while writing in his notebook. The story emerged gradually, in carefully penned segments that Eleanor read, while Mason stared across. The valley, as if distance made the painful recollections more manageable. He had enlisted in 1864, joining the Montana Volunteers, when the Union's need for soldiers grew desperate in the war's final stages. His regiment was assigned to the Army of the Potomac just in time for the brutal Petersburg Campaign. The siege had stretched through months of trench warfare, sapping men's spirits and health long before combat claimed their lives. "We lived in mud and disease," Mason wrote. "Many died without ever seeing battle." Then came April 2nd, 1865. The final breakthrough at Petersburg had been chaotic and violent. Mason's unit pushed forward through Confederate defenses, believing victory was finally within reach. They were right. The war would end just 7 days later, but for Mason, the cost was permanent. A shell had exploded mere yards away, killing 3 men instantly. Metal fragments tore through Mason's throat, severing his vocal cords and nearly taking his life. "Army surgeons saved me," he continued. "Said I was fortunate, fragment missed major vessels by a fraction of an inch. Didn't feel fortunate when I realized I would never speak again." Eleanor read each segment with growing comprehension of the man beside her, his stoicism in the face of lasting injury, his determination to build something meaningful despite returning to a world that often equated silence with deficiency. "Hardest part was my father's death," Mason wrote. "Occurred while I was away. Never said goodbye. Never heard my voice again after enlistment." The simple statement contained volumes of unspoken grief. Eleanor found herself blinking back, unexpected, tears at the quiet dignity with which he had carried these burdens. "Thank you for sharing this with me," she said softly when he finally set his pencil down. "I understand better now." Mason studied her face intently, as if searching for something specific in her expression. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, for tension visibly eased from his shoulders. He wrote once more, "Most people see only what's missing. You see what remains." The observation was startlingly accurate. From their first meeting, Eleanor had focused not on Mason's inability to speak, but on his many other qualities: his competence, integrity, the eloquence of his written communications, the respect he commanded through actions rather than words. "What remains is considerable," she replied with simple honesty. Something shifted in Mason's gaze, a vulnerability quickly masked as he rose and offered his hand to help her up. The gesture, entirely practical yet undeniably gentle, epitomized their evolving relationship, respectful awareness of boundaries coupled with growing personal connection. The ride back to the ranch unfolded in peaceful silence, both processing the deeper understanding established during their picnic conversation. As the main buildings came into view, Eleanor realized this day had irrevocably altered her perspective on her position at the Double H. What had begun as desperate employment after abandonment had evolved into something approaching partnership, and perhaps, though she scarcely dared acknowledge it, the foundation for something more permanent. Mason helped her dismount in the ranch yard, his hands steady at her waist as she slid from the saddle. Before they could be interrupted by the usual evening activities, he pressed a folded note into her hand with a questioning look. "Sunday afternoon," she read privately. "Reverend Abernathy holds services at a schoolhouse in Clearwater. Would you care to attend? Understand if you prefer not to be seen publicly with your employer." The invitation, their first potential appearance together in town, carried obvious implications about their relationship's evolving nature. Eleanor considered briefly, then met Mason's expectant gaze. "I would be pleased to accompany you," she said simply. The subtle shift in his expression, relief mingled with something warmer, confirmed the invitation's significance to him as well. He nodded once, squeezed her hand briefly, then led the horses toward the barn, while Eleanor headed to her cabin, each step feeling somehow lighter than before. Sunday arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures perfect for the 10-mile journey to town. Eleanor wore her green wool dress, now adjusted for better fit, and arranged her hair with particular care. When Mason drove the buggy to her cabin door, she noted he too had made special effort with his appearance. Clean-shaven, wearing a formal black coat over a crisp white shirt, his normally unruly hair tamed with careful combing. The drive to Clearwater provided an opportunity for quiet contemplation of how dramatically circumstances had changed since her arrival just over 2 months earlier. Then she had been abandoned and desperate, facing unknown challenges in an unfamiliar territory. Now she rode beside a man she had come to respect deeply, with growing awareness that her feelings extended well beyond gratitude or professional appreciation. Mason seemed similarly reflective, occasionally glancing at her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. When they reached the outskirts of Clearwater, he handed her a note written before their departure. "People will talk. Small towns thrive on speculation. Are you comfortable with this?" The considerate warning touched Eleanor deeply. "I've never placed much value on idle gossip," she assured him. "Whatever speculation arises, I can weather it." Her confidence earned one of his rare smiles, a genuine expression that transformed his usually serious features and created creases at the corners of his eyes. Eleanor found herself wishing she could inspire that smile more often. Clearwater's main street appeared little changed since her desperate arrival, though Eleanor's perspective had shifted dramatically. The Mercantile, now bearing the Peterson name over its entrance, no longer represented crushing disappointment, but merely another building among many. The boarding house where she had briefly stayed seemed smaller somehow, less significant in her journey. Mason guided the buggy to the small white clapboard building, serving as both school and church at the town's eastern edge. Several wagons and buggies already occupied the adjacent yard, and townspeople on Sunday finery conversed in small groups outside the entrance. Conversation faltered noticeably as Mason helped Eleanor from the buggy, confirming his warning about speculation. "Miss Mitchell, what a pleasant surprise." Mrs. Byrne approached with genuine warmth, though her sharp eyes missed nothing as she assessed their paired arrival. "And Mason, you haven't attended services in months. The Reverend will be delighted." Eleanor accepted the older woman's embrace while acutely aware of curious stares from nearby townspeople. "It's lovely to see you again, Mrs. Byrne. I hope you've been well." "Can't complain, though my arthritis acts up something fierce when rain's coming." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Town's been buzzing with talk of the Chicago buyers who visited the Double H. Tom Peterson says the contract they signed was substantial indeed." Mason nodded confirmation, but offered no written details, allowing Mrs. Byrne to guide them toward the church entrance. As they approached, Eleanor noticed a man watching them intently from near the doorway. Tall, well-dressed, with a carefully trimmed beard and calculating eyes. Something in his focused attention raised her guard. "Herbert Wallace," she whispered to Mason, recognizing the man who had abandoned her at the station. Mason's expression darkened immediately. His hand moved protectively to Eleanor's elbow as they continued forward, his posture straightening as if preparing for confrontation. Herbert, apparently noting their recognition, quickly disappeared inside the building. "Coward," Mrs. Byrne muttered. "Hasn't shown his face in church since running off to Seattle. Must have returned recently, probably when his business prospects failed, as everyone predicted." The awkward encounter cast a momentary shadow over what had begun as a pleasant outing, but Eleanor refused to let Herbert's presence diminish the day's significance. She and Mason found seats near the back of the crowded room, their arrival generating poorly concealed whispers and glances from the congregation. Reverend Abernathy, a slender man with kind eyes and prematurely white hair, delivered a thoughtful sermon on finding blessings in unexpected circumstances. Though the message seemed serendipitously appropriate to Eleanor's journey, she found her attention repeatedly drawn to Mason beside her. He followed the service attentively, his inability to join hymn singing seemingly offset by heightened appreciation for the sermon's content. When the service concluded, they joined the congregation outside for the traditional social gathering that represented Clearwater's primary community event. Mason stayed close to Eleanor's side as various townspeople approached, some with genuine welcomes, others barely disguising curiosity about their relationship. "Miss Mitchell, a pleasure to see you again." Tom Peterson, the Mercantile owner, who had purchased Herbert's business, greeted them with enthusiasm, likely motivated by Mason's importance as a customer. "And Mr. Hayes, congratulations on securing the Whitfield contract. News travels fast in business circles." Mason nodded acknowledgement, while Eleanor handled the verbal response. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson. It was indeed a fortunate development. For the ranch, I understand you're working as Mr. Hayes's housekeeper," Peterson continued, his gaze lingering appreciatively on Eleanor. If you ever seek alternative employment, I might have a position at the store. My children need a feminine influence since their mother's passing." The thinly veiled proposition, professional on its surface but carrying personal undertones, created momentary tension. Before Eleanor could formulate a diplomatic response, Mason handed Peterson a concisely written note. "Miss Mitchell's position at Double H is secure for as long as she wishes it." The subtle possessiveness in this declaration wasn't lost on either Peterson or Eleanor. The storekeeper retreated with hasty pleasantries, leaving them in relative privacy at the churchyard's edge. "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly. "Though I could have handled his presumption," Mason wrote quickly, "knew you could, still felt necessary to clarify. Peterson's been seeking a wife since arriving, approaches every unmarried woman systematically." The practical explanation masked what Eleanor suspected was a more personal motivation, but before she could pursue the matter, Herbert Wallace approached with evident determination. Up close, he appeared less substantial than his photograph had suggested. His mustache less luxuriant, his bearing less commanding, his eyes revealing calculation rather than confidence. "Miss Mitchell," he began without preamble, "I feel I owe you an explanation for our missed connection in April." Eleanor stiffened, acutely aware of Mason's protective presence beside her. "No explanation is necessary, Mr. Wallace. Your actions spoke quite clearly." Herbert flushed but persisted. "Business circumstances required my sudden departure for Seattle. I attempted to send word, but apparently my telegram never reached you." The transparent falsehood hung awkwardly between them. "I've returned to establish new ventures in Clearwater and would be pleased to renew our correspondence." The audacity of this proposal, after abandoning her without resources in a strange town, momentarily robbed Eleanor of speech. Mason, however, had no such limitation. He stepped slightly forward, his height advantage forcing Herbert to look up as he delivered a precisely written note. "Miss Mitchell's circumstances have changed. Your offer comes too late." Herbert's expression soured as he read the message. "I was addressing Miss Mitchell, not her employer," he said with poorly concealed disdain, "unless your relationship extends beyond employment." The pointed question demanded response. Eleanor found herself at a crossroads similar to her decision at the train station months earlier. Continue with cautious respectability or embrace uncertainty with potential for greater fulfillment. "Mr. Hayes has offered me respect, security, and honesty," she stated clearly, aware that nearby conversations had hushed to eavesdrop. "Three qualities conspicuously absent from our previous arrangement, Mr. Wallace. I consider his friendship vastly preferable to your renewed attention." Herbert's face hardened at the public rebuke. "I see you've found alternative protection. How convenient for both of you. A man who can't question your behavior and a woman desperate enough to accept unusual circumstances." The cruel implication brought immediate reaction. Mason stepped forward, his expression thunderous, but Eleanor placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Mr. Wallace," she said with deadly quiet, "unlike you, Mr. Hayes's character requires no voice to be evident. His actions speak what your empty words never could." She straightened to her full height. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a pleasant afternoon to continue." Taking Mason's arm, she guided him away from the sputtering Herbert toward their waiting buggy. Around them, churchgoers pretended unconvincingly not to have observed the confrontation, but Eleanor found she cared little for their opinions. The rightness of standing beside Mason against Herbert's pettiness had clarified something essential about her feelings. During the drive home, Eleanor felt Mason's frequent glances, but focused on the passing landscape, gathering her thoughts. When they were halfway to the ranch, he guided the buggy off the main trail toward a small overlook where they had clear views across the valley with no witnesses to their conversation. After securing the horses, Mason took a deep breath and began, Writing. The message, when he handed it to Eleanor, contained uncharacteristic hesitation. Need to ask something important. Understand if recent events make timing inappropriate. Please ask whatever you wish, Eleanor encouraged, suddenly nervous yet hopeful. Mason wrote for several minutes, carefully considering each word. When he finally passed her the notebook, Eleanor read a message that would fundamentally alter her future. My sister Kate visits next month. Been corresponding with her about changes at the ranch. About you. She suggests, and I agree, that your position as housekeeper creates uncomfortable ambiguity. Townspeople speculate. Wallace's insinuations, while despicable, highlight perception issues. Eleanor's heart sank momentarily, fearing he might suggest ending her employment to quell rumors. But Mason continued, I respect you too much for continued ambiguity. Would you consider a more formal arrangement? Not immediately, but with understanding, of intention, proper courtship leading to partnership in all aspects of ranch and life, marriage when you feel ready. The proposal, characteristically thoughtful in offering courtship rather than immediate marriage, left Eleanor momentarily speechless. Mason watched her face intently, vulnerability evident in his usually guarded expression. I know I'm not what you expected, he wrote quickly when she didn't immediately respond. Cannot offer normal conversation or social ease, but can promise respect, security, shared purpose, and affection that grows stronger daily. Eleanor looked from the written words to the man before her, this quiet, honorable rancher, who communicated more through actions than most men managed with endless words. In just over 2 months, he had transformed her understanding of what mattered in a partnership. Not social position or verbal charm, but fundamental integrity and mutual respect. Yes, she said simply, meeting his anxious gaze with certainty. I would consider that arrangement. In fact, I would welcome it. The tension in Mason's shoulders released visibly. He reached for her hand, his work-roughened fingers gentle as they enveloped hers. For a long moment they sat in silence that required no words or written notes, a shared understanding of possibilities unfolding before them. When Mason finally released her hand to write again, his message was brief, but eloquent. You were abandoned at a train station through one man's dishonor. I lost my voice, defending principles I believed were worth sacrifice. Perhaps fate brings damaged people together to create something whole. The observation brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes, not from sadness, but from recognition of its fundamental truth. Perhaps it does, she agreed softly, as afternoon light gilded the landscape around them. Eleanor Mitchell, once a desperate mail-order bride rejected at a station platform, found herself beside a silent rancher whose heart spoke volumes his throat could not. The journey ahead would bring challenges, but for the first time since leaving Pennsylvania, she felt not just resigned to her circumstances, but genuinely hopeful about her future. Sometimes, she reflected, as Mason helped her back into the buggy, with gentle hands, life's cruelest disappointments merely redirected one toward greater joy than originally sought. Herbert Wallace's abandonment, viewed from this new perspective, seemed less tragedy than necessary redirection toward where she truly belonged. August brought golden light and lengthening shadows to the Double H Ranch as summer began its gradual surrender to autumn. The days following Mason's proposal unfolded in a gentle rhythm of work and subtle courtship. Though their daily routines remained largely unchanged, small gestures marked the shift in their relationship. Wildflowers appearing on the kitchen table each morning, shared walks in the evening twilight, and increasingly personal notes exchanged throughout the day. It feels different, Eleanor confided to Emma as they picked late summer beans in the kitchen garden. Not just between Mason and me, but how I experience the ranch itself, as if I'm seeing it through the eyes of someone with a permanent stake in its future rather than a temporary employee. Emma smiled knowingly. That's because you are, child. The moment he asked and you accepted, your perspective naturally shifted. She straightened with a groan, pressing a hand to her lower back. Been waiting years to see Mason find someone who understands him. Kate and I worried he'd work himself into an early grave with no one to share his life. The mention of Mason's sister brought fresh nervousness. Kate Hayes Matthews would arrive in just 3 days for her long-planned visit, her first opportunity to assess the woman her brother intended to marry. Though Mason assured Eleanor through written notes that Kate would welcome her warmly, Eleanor couldn't help feeling anxious about meeting this important figure in Mason's life. "What if she disapproves?" Eleanor asked, voicing her deepest concern. Her opinion clearly matters greatly to Mason. Emma snorted dismissively. Kate's practical above all else. She's watched her brother struggle with isolation for years while building this ranch into something remarkable. The fact that he's found someone who appreciates him as he is, voice or no voice, that's all that will matter to her. She patted Eleanor's hand reassuringly. "Besides, I've already written telling her what a blessing you've been to this household. She trusts my judgment." The revelation that Emma had been corresponding with Kate about her wasn't entirely surprising, but it did highlight how thoroughly Eleanor's life had become integrated with the Hayes family circle. What had begun as desperate employment had transformed into belonging, a sensation both comforting and slightly overwhelming after years of insecurity in Pennsylvania. The following afternoon, Eleanor was kneading bread dough when Mason appeared in the kitchen doorway, his expression unusually animated. He crossed to the table and placed a telegraph message before her, watching expectantly as she wiped flour from her hands to read it. "Arriving tomorrow. Stop 1 day early. Stop bringing David and children. Stop. Need extra accommodations. Stop. Kate. Your sister is coming tomorrow with her family." Eleanor confirmed immediate practical concerns surfacing. "We'll need to prepare the additional bedroom and find space for the children." Mason nodded, writing quickly. "David is a doctor. Children are Robert, 10, and Emily, 7. Haven't seen them in 2 years. Kate's telegram is intentionally surprising. Her humor." The accelerated timeline sent Eleanor into efficient action, directing ranch hands to bring extra beds from storage, while she transformed the rarely used sewing room into suitable accommodations for the children. By evening, the house had been thoroughly cleaned, extra provisions secured from the root cellar, and special treats baked in anticipation of the younger visitors. When Eleanor finally collapsed into a kitchen chair, exhausted but satisfied with the preparations, Mason handed her a note with an apologetic expression. "Sorry for Kate's dramatics. She enjoys creating small chaos, but she's kind-hearted beneath the mischief. I look forward to meeting her," Eleanor replied truthfully. Though I admit to some nervousness, Mason studied her thoughtfully before writing, "Kate will see what I see, someone exceptional who brings life and warmth where they were lacking." The simple compliment warmed Eleanor more deeply than the kitchen's ever-present fire. In their developing relationship, Mason's written words carried particular weight, each phrase carefully chosen rather than casually spoken. His economy of expression rendered his compliments especially meaningful. The Hayes family arrived the following afternoon in a flurry of trunks, excited children's voices, and Kate's commanding presence. Eleanor's first impression of Mason's sister was of energy barely contained, a slender woman with Mason's blue eyes and determination, but possessing the vivacity he expressed only through written words. Dr. David Matthews proved more reserved, with a scholarly demeanor that complemented his wife's exuberance. The children, dusty from travel but clearly well-raised, offered polite greetings before their attention was captured by the ranch's many fascinations. Kate embraced Mason warmly before turning her assessing gaze to Eleanor. So you're the miracle Emma's letters described, she said without preamble, the woman who understands my brother without words. Eleanor flushed slightly at the direct approach. I wouldn't claim any particular insight, Mrs. Matthews. Your brother communicates quite effectively in his own way. Kate, please, she corrected, linking her arm through Eleanor's and steering her toward the house while the men handled luggage. And you're precisely right. Mason has never lacked ability to communicate, only patience from others to receive his message. Her grip tightened slightly in emphasis. That you recognize this tells me everything I need to know about your suitability. The DI forthright approval, delivered with Kate's characteristic directness, eased Eleanor's primary concern. As they entered the house, Kate continued her assessment with frank admiration. The place has been transformed since my last visit. Curtains actually hanging evenly, surfaces free of dust, and, she inhaled appreciatively, the smell of proper cooking rather than bachelor attempts at sustenance. Eleanor has brought order to more than the household, Mason wrote in a note he handed his sister. The entire ranch operation runs more smoothly with her coordination of domestic matters. Kate's expression softened as she read her brother's words. I can see that's not all she's brought, she observed quietly. There's a lightness about you I haven't seen since before Petersburg, Mason. The evening unfolded in comfortable family interactions. David sharing medical anecdotes from Helena, the children peppering their uncle with questions he answered. Through written notes and Eleanor's verbal translations, Kate observing the easy rhythm that had developed between her brother and his intended. After the younger family members retired, the adults lingered at the dining table over coffee. I must admit, I was skeptical when Emma first wrote about you, Kate confessed to Eleanor. Not because I doubted your character, but because I've watched. Various women attempt to penetrate my brother's reserve over the years. Most find his silence disconcerting or view him as a project to be fixed rather than a person to be understood. Mason shifted uncomfortably at this frank discussion of his previous relationships, but Kate continued undeterred. But seeing you together, how you've developed your own language of gestures and expressions, how you respect his written communications rather than rushing to speak for him. It's remarkable. She glanced meaningfully between them. When do you plan to formalize your arrangement? The direct question brought color to Eleanor's cheeks. We've agreed to a proper courtship period before marriage, she explained. There's no specific timeline. Yet, Kate raised an eyebrow at her brother. Courtship? Mason, you're 35 years old, not some blushing youth, and Eleanor clearly brings stability and purpose to your household. She turned to her husband with exasperation. David, please explain to my brother that at his age, extended courtships are unnecessary formalities. The doctor chuckled, clearly accustomed to his wife's forceful opinions. I believe, my dear, that Mason and Miss Mitchell are entitled to progress at whatever pace suits them. His kind eyes met Eleanor's with understanding. Though I would observe, professionally speaking, that your presence has markedly improved my brother-in-law's physical condition. He's gained healthy weight and shows fewer signs of the chronic exhaustion Kate reported after her last visit. Mason's expression suggested he was reconsidering the wisdom of having his family visit, but there was affection beneath his discomfort. He wrote a brief note and slid it to Eleanor beneath the table, where only she could read it. Ignore Kate's pushing. We decide our timing, though I admit patience grows challenging. The private communication, with its hint of deeper feelings carefully restrained, sent warmth flooding through Eleanor. She gently touched his hand beneath the table, a brief, hidden gesture that conveyed understanding. The following morning, while Mason showed David and the children the ranch operations, Kate cornered Eleanor in the kitchen with sisterly directness. He wrote to me about how you met, she began without preamble. abandoned by your intended, facing desperate circumstances, yet you've transformed potential tragedy into something beautiful." She paused, studying Eleanor carefully. "But I wonder if you've fully considered what marriage to my brother entails, not just the day-to-day adaptations to his silence, but the societal implications." Eleanor set aside the coffee pot she'd been filling. "What do you mean?" "You experienced some of it at church," Kate said perceptively. "The assumptions, the whispers, the occasional cruelty disguised as concern. Mason's disability makes some people uncomfortable, as if silence somehow diminishes intelligence or worth." Her expression hardened momentarily. "Our parents shielded him from the worst of it growing up, but after his injury," she shook her head, "let's just say certain friends proved themselves unworthy of the name." Understanding dawned in Eleanor's mind. Kate wasn't questioning her suitability for Mason, but rather ensuring she fully comprehended the challenges they would face together. "I have never been particularly concerned with society's assessment," Eleanor replied honestly. "In Pennsylvania, I was judged for being unmarried at 24. Here I've been judged for working in a bachelor's household. People will always find reasons for disapproval." She met Kate's gaze directly. "What matters is that Mason and I understand each other. The rest is just noise." Kate's face transformed with a smile remarkably similar to her brother's rare expressions of joy. "That," she declared with satisfaction, "is exactly the answer I hoped for." She embraced Eleanor impulsively. "Welcome to the family, sister. Officially or not, you're already one of us." The Matthews family departed 2 days later, leaving behind welcome chaos and strengthened connections. As their carriage disappeared down the lane, Mason turned to Eleanor with an expression of mingled relief and contentment. "Your family is wonderful," she assured him, correctly interpreting his unspoken question. "Particularly Kate. Her directness is actually quite refreshing. After years of social pretense in Pennsylvania." Mason's shoulders relaxed visibly as he handed her a note. "Kate approves wholeheartedly, told me privately I'd be a fool to risk losing you to extended courtship. Perhaps she's right." The suggestion hung between them like a tangible possibility. As they walked back toward the house, arm in arm in the September sunshine, Eleanor found herself contemplating not just their relationship's official status, but the broader future taking shape before them. Seasons flowing one into another, the ranch evolving under their shared guidance, potential children learning to understand their father's unique communication. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching twilight settle across the valley, Mason handed her a carefully written message different from his usual practical notes. The paper contained a poem, meticulously copied in his distinctive handwriting. "Silence is not empty, but full of answers. In the space between spoken words, I found your understanding. Where others heard nothing, you perceived everything that matters." Below the verse, he had added a simple question. "October wedding?" Eleanor read the words twice, touched beyond measure by both the sentiment and the vulnerability required to share such personal expression. She looked up to find Mason watching her intently, his usually stoic features revealing hope and uncertainty in equal measure. "Yes," she answered simply. "October would be perfect." His smile, the full, unrestrained expression she had glimpsed only rarely, transformed his face completely. In that moment, Eleanor fully understood Emma's earlier observation. Perspective changes everything. What had begun as her greatest disappointment at Clearwater Station had led through unexpected pathways to her greatest joy. Mason took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. No written words were necessary to communicate what passed between them as the first stars appeared above the Montana mountains. Promises more binding than any marriage certificate. understood in a silence more eloquent than speech. October painted the Montana landscape in spectacular hues, aspen groves transformed to shimmering gold, scrub oak blazing crimson against evergreen hillsides, and prairie grasses rippling in amber waves beneath crystal blue skies. Nature itself seemed determined to provide the perfect backdrop for the wedding planned for the third Saturday of the month. Preparations proceeded with practical efficiency under Eleanor's direction. She had no interest in elaborate ceremonies or extravagant displays, insisting instead on a simple, meaningful gathering that reflected the values she and Mason shared. The main house underwent subtle transformation. Polished to gleaming perfection, decorated with autumn foliage and late-blooming wildflowers gathered by the ranch hands, who had enthusiastically embraced the upcoming celebration. Never seen. The men so invested in housekeeping, Emma observed with amusement as three cowboys carefully hung garlands along the porch railings. You've won their loyalty completely. They're doing it for Mason, Eleanor demurred, arranging chrysanthemums in Mason's mother's crystal vases. Emma shook her head. For both of you. This ranch has functioned like a collection of parts for years, necessary pieces working together but missing something essential. You provided the connection that transformed it into a true community. The observation lingered. With Eleanor's wedding preparations continued, what had begun as desperate employment had evolved into belonging, not just to Mason, but to the entire Double H community. She had found her place in this rugged landscape, far from Pennsylvania's familiar confines, among people who valued actions over social conventions. 3 days before the wedding, an unexpected letter arrived with the supply wagon from town. Eleanor recognized Charlotte's handwriting immediately and opened it with curious anticipation, wondering what news her friend might share from her former home. The contents proved far more disturbing than anticipated. Dearest Eleanor, Charlotte wrote, I must warn you of troubling developments. James Cooper has been making increasingly specific inquiries about your whereabouts, claiming family legal matters require your attention. I maintained ignorance, but last week discovered he departed for Montana Territory, allegedly on business, but carrying your photograph and expressing determination to resolve unfinished matters. His manner suggested concerning obsession rather than legitimate purpose. Please exercise caution, dear friend. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she folded the letter. James Cooper's unwelcome attention had been uncomfortable enough in Pennsylvania. His pursuit across the continent suggested a fixation that transcended mere impropriety. She debated whether to share this concerning news with Mason, reluctant to introduce shadows into their wedding preparations. Yet concealment felt wrong in a relationship built on honesty and mutual protection. That evening, she placed Charlotte's letter in Mason's hands, watching his expression darken as he read. I'm sorry to bring this concern forward now, she apologized. Perhaps nothing will come of it. Cooper may never locate me here. Mason shook his head firmly, writing with determined strokes. No apologies for honesty. Better to be forewarned. Will alert Joe and ranch hands to watch for strangers. His practical response reassured Eleanor, though worry lingered as their wedding day approached. The potential threat couldn't overshadow her joy, however, as final preparations fell into place. Kate arrived 2 days early, bringing a wedding gift that brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes, a family Bible containing Hayes' generations, meticulously recorded, with space left for the next entries to include her name. Every Hayes bride receives this to maintain, Kate explained, handling the leather-bound volume with reverence. Our mother added Mason's birth, I added my children, and now you'll record whatever new branches grow from your union. The gift represented more than family tradition. It symbolized complete acceptance into a lineage that would continue through her. For a woman who had travelled west seeking belonging through marriage to a stranger, finding true family exceeded all expectations. The wedding morning dawned clear and crisp, with just enough autumn chill to justify the small fireplace blazing. In Eleanor's cabin, as she prepared, she had declined Kate's offer of her own wedding dress, choosing instead a new creation sewn by her own hands, simple cream-coloured wool with subtle embroidery at collar and cuffs, complemented by a shawl in deep blue that matched Mason's eyes. Emma fussed with Eleanor's hair, arranging it in an elegant knot, adorned with tiny white asters. "Something borrowed," she explained, pinning a delicate silver brooch to Eleanor's bodice. "This was my mother's." "Thank you," Eleanor said softly, touched by the older woman's sentiment, "for everything. I wouldn't be here without your guidance, those first difficult weeks." Emma waved away her gratitude. "You'd have managed regardless. Always had that quiet strength about you, even standing exhausted and abandoned at the train station." She stepped back to assess her handiwork. "There now, ready to become Mrs. Hayes?" The name, soon to be hers officially, felt right in a way Eleanor could never have anticipated when she first agreed to become Mrs. Wallace. Life's curious pathways had led her precisely where she belonged, through circumstances that had seemed like disaster at the time. Reverend Abernathy conducted the ceremony on the ranch house porch, with the spectacular autumn landscape serving as nature's cathedral. Guests included the entire ranch staff, neighboring families, and a few townspeople from Clearwater whose acceptance had been earned through Eleanor and Mason's dignified conduct during her first months in Montana. Mason waited at the porch steps, his tall figure commanding in a new black suit, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion. When Eleanor emerged from her cabin on Joe Turner's arm, the foreman having offered to stand in paternal role, Mason's expression conveyed everything words could not: wonder, gratitude, and a depth of feeling that required no verbal expression. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. Reverend Abernathy had thoughtfully adapted traditional vows to accommodate Mason's silence, allowing written responses where spoken ones would normally occur. When the moment came to express his commitment, Mason handed Eleanor a carefully prepared card bearing words she would treasure forever. "I promise to cherish your presence as you have honored my silence, to build alongside you in equal partnership, to communicate through actions and written words the devotion that fills my heart. All that I am and will become belongs to you, as long as life remains." Eleanor's voice trembled slightly as she spoke. Her own vows in return. "I promise to honor the strength behind your silence, to walk beside you in good fortune and hardship, to build our shared dreams with determination equal to yours. My heart recognizes yours beyond all words, and I commit myself completely to our life together." The simple gold bands they exchanged held no elaborate engravings or precious stones, yet symbolized something far more valuable than material wealth. A commitment forged through understanding rather than convention, chosen with clear eyes and full hearts. "I pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Abernathy concluded with evident satisfaction. "What God has joined together, let no one put asunder." The celebration continued well into evening, with tables set on the sprawling lawn, for a feast prepared by neighboring ranchers' wives and the Double H cook. Lanterns illuminated the gathering as darkness fell, and someone produced a fiddle for dancing beneath the emerging stars. Mason and Eleanor circulated among their guests, his written notes and her verbal responses creating a seamless interaction that no longer seemed unusual to those who witnessed their natural partnership. When the fiddler struck up a waltz, Mason led Eleanor to the cleared space, serving as dance floor. The silent question in his eyes, asking permission for this public display. "Yes," she answered softly. "I'd love to dance with my husband." His expertise surprised her, smooth, confident steps guiding her through the waltz with unexpected grace. At her raised eyebrow he smiled and later wrote, "Kate insisted I learn. Before leaving for war, said every gentleman needs dancing skills regardless of circumstances." As evening deepened and guests gradually departed, Eleanor found a moment of quiet reflection on the porch steps, watching moonlight silver the landscape that had become home in just 6 extraordinary months. Mason joined her, his familiar presence, bringing comfort as he placed a light blanket around her shoulders against the autumn chill. "Happy?" he wrote simply, sitting beside her. "Completely," she confirmed, leaning gently against his shoulder. "Though it still seems remarkable how differently things turned out from what I planned." Mason considered this before writing, "Life's best gifts often come disguised as disappointments." The observation perfectly captured Eleanor's journey from abandoned mail-order bride to cherished wife. Herbert Wallace's rejection, painful and humiliating in the moment, had redirected her path toward something infinitely more valuable than the safe but soulless future she had originally sought. Their peaceful reflection was interrupted by Joe Turner, approaching with uncharacteristic urgency. "Rider coming fast up the main road," he reported quietly. "Not one of ours, and traveling at night suggests purpose rather than casual visit." Mason rose immediately, the protective shift in his posture communicating clear concern. He wrote swiftly, "Take Eleanor inside. Alert the men discreetly. Maybe nothing but it might be Cooper," Eleanor finished, Charlotte's warning. Letter fresh in her mind, despite the day's joy. The unwelcome intrusion on their wedding night created a shadow of anxiety as Eleanor followed Emma inside, while Mason and Joe intercepted the approaching rider. Through the window, she watched their figures illuminated by lantern light, Mason standing tall and unmoving as a stranger dismounted. Even at a distance, Eleanor recognized James Cooper's distinctive bearing, the same arrogant posture that had made her uncomfortable in her cousin's home years earlier. Whatever pretense had brought him to Montana, his arrival on this particular evening suggested calculation rather than coincidence. She watched Mason read a note Cooper extended, observed the stiffening of her husband's shoulders that signaled anger carefully controlled. When Mason wrote a response that made Cooper's gestures become agitated, Eleanor made her decision. This was no longer Pennsylvania, where social constraints might require feminine withdrawal from confrontation. This was her home, her wedding day, and her past to address directly. Ignoring Emma's protests, Eleanor stepped onto the porch, the October moonlight illuminating her approach, as she joined Mason and Joe in confronting her unwelcome visitor. "Mr. Cooper," she acknowledged coolly, "you've traveled a considerable distance uninvited." Cooper's expression revealed momentary surprise at her direct approach before recovering his composure. "Eleanor, you're looking well. Rural life apparently agrees with you." His gaze flickered to Mason with poorly disguised contempt. "Though I confess surprise at your choice of situation." "Mrs. Hayes," she corrected firmly. "As of today, and my situation is precisely what I choose it to be." Cooper's facade cracked slightly. "Marriage? To a man who can't even speak? This is madness, Eleanor. Whatever desperation drove you to this remote wilderness, there are better solutions." He reached into his coat, producing legal papers. "Your aunt's estate in Philadelphia. I've been appointed executor. There's a modest inheritance that would allow you to return east and establish yourself properly. The revelation might once have represented salvation. Now it merely confirmed what Eleanor had long suspected. Cooper had engineered her match with Herbert Wallace to separate her from potential inheritance, abandoning the scheme only when actual funds materialized. How convenient that you discovered." "This inheritance just when I've established a life beyond your reach," she observed, her calm words belying the anger beneath. "Whatever financial interest brought you here, Mr. Cooper, you've wasted your journey. My home and future are here." Mason stepped forward then, placing himself slightly before Eleanor in protective stance. He handed Cooper a note written with uncharacteristic bluntness. "My wife has made her position clear. Your presence is unwelcome. Depart immediately." Cooper's expression darkened at the dismissal. "This isn't finished. There are legal matters. Any legitimate legal matters can be handled through proper channels," Eleanor interrupted. "Send documentation to our ranch address, and our lawyer in Helena will review it." She took Mason's arm deliberately. "Now, as my husband indicated, please leave. We're celebrating our wedding day." The united front, Eleanor's verbal firmness and Mason's imposing physical presence, left Cooper little room to maneuver. With poorly concealed frustration, he remounted his horse, calling back as he turned toward town, "This isn't the last you'll hear from me." "Actually," Joe Turner interjected with dangerous quietness, "I believe it is." The foreman's hand rested meaningfully near his holster. Mrs. Hayes made herself clear. Any further disturbance would be most unfortunate. Cooper's departure down the moonlit road marked the final severance of Eleanor's past connections. Whatever manipulative scheme had brought him to Montana had faltered against the reality of her new life, not as desperate spinster, but as respected ranch wife with a community's protection surrounding her. Later that night, in the privacy of what was now their shared bedroom in the main house, Eleanor described the encounter to Mason, who had missed some verbal exchanges while writing his notes. "I don't believe we'll see him again," she concluded. "Cooper prays. And vulnerable women, not those with protection and purpose." Mason studied her thoughtfully before writing, "You needed no protection. Your strength alone would have sent him running." The observation, reflecting genuine admiration rather than flattery, warmed Eleanor deeply. This man, who had initially appeared as simply a solution to desperate circumstances, had proven himself the true answer to unformed questions she hadn't known to ask. What constituted genuine partnership? How did respect manifest in daily interactions? What foundation supported lasting commitment? As autumn gave way to Montana's challenging winter, Eleanor and Mason settled into married life with surprising ease. Their communication methods developed. During courtship, evolved further, incorporating small gestures and expressions that required neither voice nor written word. The ranch thrived under their collaborative leadership, with Eleanor gradually assuming management of accounts and correspondence that had previously burdened Mason. When spring arrived, bringing renewal to the landscape, Eleanor confirmed what she had suspected through the winter months. Their family would expand before year's end. The news, shared through happy tears and Mason's rarely seen full smile, completed a circle that had begun with desperate circumstances at Clearwater Station. Life unfolds in unexpected patterns, Eleanor reflected, as Mason's hand rested gently against her still flat abdomen. What appeared as cruel abandonment had actually been redirection toward unimaginable fulfillment. The silent rancher who had claimed her at her lowest moment had ultimately given voice to emotions deeper than words could express. Together, they would write their continuing story, not through conventional speech, but through the language of shared purpose, mutual respect, and enduring love that required no voice to be clearly heard. Up next, you've got two more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.